Hello, everybody. So, this is going to be a kind of full walkthrough of the scaffolded reading piece that I spent some time presenting during our ERWC meeting. I was able to present key pieces or key elements of this, but I also wanted to provide a full walkthrough that just shows how I present this to my class, how I break it down to my classes, and how I take this and use this as not only a scaffold but a way to initiate learning, initiate the understanding of close reading and analyzing a text, but also I utilize it as a tool to help release responsibility from me to the students over time. So you'll see that this document is one page. I do provide this handout to the students at the beginning of the year, and I have them tape it into their notebooks. They have it for the entire year, and that way, even though I require them to go through and do each of these steps at the beginning, they are able to little by little kind of release themselves, and I release the responsibility to them as we move through the year. And so there are pieces of this that they may use, they may adjust, they may shift as they realize the kind of readers that they are, how they want to respond to the text, and or whether or not they need things like the sentence frames, etc. And so this is really something that they can utilize in a lot of different forms as they move through their journey, especially in the full year through ERWC. You'll see on this handout that I do break it down into 9 steps or 9 pieces. And those 9 pieces are very closely matched up with and very closely based in both the ERWC strategies and also with AVID strategies. And so you'll see kind of a combination of both of those if you are familiar with those two text analysis strategies. The other thing is that this set of close reading prompts and directions in this handout is kind of a condensed set of directions for all of the things that students go through with each of their readings in all of their texts through the units in ERWC. And so you'll see some similarities there that all of the units in the text ask them to go in, to look at the author, to analyze the ethos, to make predictions about the text, to look at and be able to pull pieces from the text and or main ideas, etc., and then be able to convey those ideas. And so this is very much based on that same structure and same kind of order that ERWC asks them to do in the units. It just condensed into a kind of more functional and easier to use piece that students can kind of look at and say, okay, first I'm going to do this, second, third, and then they go through this process each time that they're looking at a text. And you'll see that we start off with something as simple as highlighting the title of our document, and then we get all the way down to number 9 into reading against the grain and actually starting to impart their ideas as students onto the conversation that the text has started. So I'm going to be utilizing this as I walk through this page, and I'm actually going to be applying this to one of the unit texts, which is the Want to Get into College, Learn to Fail. And that is one of the texts for the What's Next unit. And I'm going to go through this just like I would with my students. And the first time I do this with my students, I do go through and walk through this process with them. So this is not something where I like hand them this document and I'm like, okay, go ahead and do this. I actually walk through this the first time. We do all of it together. And that way they have a much better kind of not only understanding, but a good practice for like, okay, when I do this, this is what this should look like. So the first thing I do is tell them, all right, you guys go ahead and get out both your close reading prompts and directions handout and whatever text it is that we're working on. In this case, it's Want to Get into College, Learn to Fail. And then I tell them to go ahead and get out 2 highlighter colors. If you want to make it mandatory that they use a specific type of highlighter color, go ahead. I don't really care either way because they're going to be creating a key at the top of their page. So I tell them, go ahead and grab 2 highlighter colors, whatever those are. Those are way too close together, so I'll go pink and green for this one. And a writing utensil. So 2 highlighter colors, writing utensil. And then we get into it. I'm like, all right, you guys, take a look at your close reading prompts and directions. What does number 1 ask us to do? They respond, obviously, and they say, oh, we need to highlight the title. Fantastic. Pick a highlighter color, you guys. I don't care what color. And then go ahead and highlight your title. Also take a moment and look to see if there's a subtitle. If there is, highlight that as well. If not, then obviously just highlight your title. And then we're going to go in together. And I'm usually doing this under a document camera, just like I am for this presentation. And we highlight the title together. I said, all right, great. So Want to Get into College, Learn to Fail. That's our title. All right, so now what does the next thing ask you to do? And they're like, well, it says start a key. I said, yeah, it absolutely does say start a key. And then I go in and I start the key with my students. I'm like, all right, take that same highlighter color. We're going to come to the very top of our page or wherever we have space. We're just going to make a little mark in that same highlighter color. And then I let them know why it is that we want to create a key. I tell them, look, you guys, for some of these units, we're going to be reading 4, 5, 6+ texts. And by the time you reach the end of the unit, you might not remember exactly what you were thinking about when you read that very first text like 6 weeks ago. So what a key allows us to do is go back to that text and look for what color we did things in, or what we underlined, or what we highlighted, what we circled, etc. And remind yourself of, oh, if I want to find this specific type of information, I'm going to go to this thing in this text. So there, I'm just going to literally next to this write that this is the title and that this is going to be connected to our prediction. And I have them go ahead and write that down as well. Then we go into our second piece. I'm like, all right, what does number 2 tell you to do? And they're like, it says create a prediction sentence. I said, great. Create a prediction sentence. Or what's the other thing that you can do? Well, we can ask a question. All right, well, this is the first time we're doing this. So for this time, we're going to go ahead and we're just going to do a prediction sentence. Now, again, you have a lot of space in this area. You can do your prediction sentence wherever. I usually do it right here next to the title so that we know it's connected. And I usually just write predict, and then I'm going to use my sentence frame that's there. Now, since this is the first time that students would be doing this, I require them to use one of the sentence frames that are on the paper for each of these steps for this first time. Number 1, because it gives them a format. Number 2, because it gives them a structured way to answer. And then lastly, it gives them a structured and more academic way to answer than just, I predict, blah, blah, blah. It actually makes them not only say what they think the author is going to be doing, but using summarizing and charting verbs, and also telling me why it is that they think that's what it's going to be about. And then I tell them, all right, so our sentence frame says, from the title, and then we write down the title, I infer. To infer just means to predict, you guys, and or to hypothesize. Inferences are like English's version of science's hypothesis. Okay, so I infer that the author is going to, and then we're going to use a summarizing and charting verb, and we're going to finish off that thought. What is it that we think the author is going to do? And so I go ahead and write this with them. So I do predict, and then I write the actual sentence frame there. So predict, and then from the title, and then we're going to do want to get into college. Learn to fail. Okay, I infer the author and I'm going to use will instead of is going to. Will. And now I want to use a summarizing and charting verb. And so I always provide them with those summarizing and charting verbs at the exact same time that I provide them with this handout, because that's going to give them those tools and that ability to utilize those summarizing and charting verbs, not only for this, but also for any of the other pieces that request or require them to do summarizing and charting verbs. And there's a list. This is what our summarizing and charting verbs look like. And there's a list of them. And you'll see that these are kind of higher level verbs that are going to require the students to actually go in, pick a verb that actually makes sense, instead of just always saying, I infer the author is going to tell. I am going to infer that the author says. I want more than that. And so they're going to go in, look at these, and again, depending on your population and or your students, you may have to go in and kind of assess some of these words and look at what they mean. But these are where they have to pull from. And so I tell them, okay, now we need a summarizing and charting verb. So based on the title, want to get into college, learn to fail, what do you think the author might be doing? And somebody might say, oh, I think they're going to conclude. Okay, perfect. Conclude. Author will conclude. Well, what are they going to conclude? And then I give them some time, some space to think about it. What do you think they're going to conclude? Oh, well, the author is going to conclude that, like, in order to do well in college, you need to be able to, like, bounce back from failure. Awesome. Let's go ahead and write that down. You can write this in your own words because obviously this is your prediction. So I infer the author will conclude that in order to succeed in college, we have to bounce back from failure. Now, your prediction sentence doesn't have to be true. Your prediction sentence doesn't have to come true. You might realize after reading a text that it's not at all what you thought it was going to be about. That's okay. The point of a prediction sentence is to get you thinking about the text. It's to get you thinking what you think it might be about and start your brain going, considering what it is that this author might be talking about. So, is it probably going to be about something like this? Yeah, it probably is. But could it be something completely different? Sure, it could be. Guess what? There's no necessarily right or wrong answer here. This is really just to get students thinking. So, from there, now we're going to go on to our next step, and that's to number our paragraphs or stanzas, which we don't have to do with this one because we already have those numbered. But I let my students know, look, you're not always going to get texts that have numbered paragraphs, and sometimes you're going to have to go in there and you're going to have to number those paragraphs. And then I go through and I explain why we number paragraphs. Okay, we number paragraphs, you guys, because you're going to be, again, utilizing these texts as evidence. And when you have, again, 6 or 7 texts or more that you're trying to pull from, it's very difficult to just be like, oh yeah, well, like somewhere in there in that text there was this one piece, right, of evidence that the author used, and you don't really know where it is. But instead, if you have numbered paragraphs, you can actually reference that, whether it be in a discussion, in your actual writing, whatever it is, you can reference that and say, hey, in Want to Get into College, Learn to Fail, in paragraph 4, the author talks about blah, 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 right? And this is what you want to say about that. And so I go through the process as we're doing this the first time of why. Why is it that we want to do these pieces? So that's why we're going to number our paragraphs. But again, this one is numbered for us, so we don't have to do that piece. And then the next one is to place a box around the author name, publication, source information, and then we use a sentence frame again to assess the credibility. So I let them know that, okay, our author, right, is Angel B. Perez. We're going to box this piece. This came from Education Week on January 31st, 2012. I then have them look through and say, okay, is there any other information? They always go, oh yeah, Shields, right, at the end. Here's more information. So I have them go in, I have them box this information. And then I give them about 3 minutes. And I let them know, okay, read the information you have here, both this piece and what's here, and decide if you know enough about Angel Perez to give me a good understanding of their credibility. And this is really the first conversations that students and I have about credibility, about ethos, about is this author trustworthy? Do they have the credentials to be talking about what they're talking about? And so I may have them go look them up or take a look at the information that's already provided. And then we're going to create the ethos sentence. Now, I usually have them create for this one. I have them create it down here at the bottom just because there's extra space and it gives us kind of room to do that piece. And so again, we're going to be going back to this text and we have our sentence frame here. And that's the one we're going to use. And you'll notice that this does work for both informational texts and poetry or fictional text as well, but they are two different kinds of things because the ethos of an author in an informational text is really different than looking at the ethos of an author in a fiction or a piece of poetry. So we're going to use this first one. So we're going to write this, and again, we write this together. The source, excuse me, and author, and then again, they're going to need to pick one. All right, you guys pick one. Is he credible? Is he not credible? Obviously, typically they say, oh, this author is credible. Okay. Is credible. And then because. So again, it's that not allowing us to just stop at the like it is or it isn't, but why? What is it about this? And so then we have a conversation. All right, you guys, so what makes you think that this author is credible, and to come up with all the things that we would come up with. Well, he's talking about college and he's the vice president and the dean of admissions. Yeah, absolutely. He's worked at multiple colleges. So like he works at the UCLA, which is like a huge college. Absolutely, guys, that's going to make him probably credible. What about the source? Well, it's Education Week. It's a journal, right, written for like educators, etc. So it's probably going to be credible. Right, absolutely. And so then we go in and we add those reasons, right? So the source and author, and it really should be R, credible, because, right, Perez is, excuse me, a dean of admissions, has worked for reputable colleges, and Education Week is a published magazine. And again, you can go further than this. If you wanted them to give you more specifics, if you wanted to talk about the background of the source and or the author and you wanted more detailed information, obviously, then those things can all be done. But this, again, is just to get them in this for the first time and starting to look at ethos of an author and trustworthiness and credibility, and should we be skeptical of what it is that we're reading. All right, and so that's our ethos piece. Now, we're going to move on, and we're already at this point, we're only about 16 minutes in, we're already at this point down to our section 5. So now we need that second highlighter color, which is here. Now, we're going to add this to our key at the top, and the second highlighter color is going to be our vocabulary. Now, this may vary, again, based on the needs of your student. If you have higher level students who aren't going to need as much support with vocabulary, then obviously this is going to be less supported piece. If you have ELD, or if you have students who are really struggling with vocabulary, or you have a text where you know there are pieces where like, hey, I need you guys to go ahead and highlight these words, then obviously you could assign words and you could make this into a bigger piece. But this is how I really, on a basic level, go through vocabulary with my students. Now, I typically structure vocabulary in a way that integrates it with the text. I believe it is the most functional for students, and I believe that having the vocabulary connected to the text and be working within the text is the easiest way for them to see that language and or those words used in conjunction with and in connection with the text and the concepts versus doing them kind of in seclusion or like as a side piece. So for this piece, I have them choose that second highlighter color, and then I tell them, all right, we're going to learn a skill, you guys, that you probably haven't practiced a whole lot, and we call that skill scanning, okay? Or skimming, and we're going to do this in a very quick amount of time. So I'm going to only give you about 1 minute and 30 seconds, and I want you to skim the entire text, and all you're looking for when you skim this is words and or phrases that pop out to you that you feel like you're either not real comfortable with or that you really don't know at all and that you need to know in order to understand the text. You're not reading this. You're not going to read this. You're not going to go word for word or line for line or paragraph by paragraph. And by the end of that 1.5 minutes, you should be completely done highlighting the words. It's the only thing that you're doing. And then I will actually have them start. I will give them that 1.5 minutes. And at that 1.5 minutes, I will stop them. So I'm like, all right, you have 1.5 minutes. All you're doing is scanning, and you're just looking for words or phrases that you don't know well, and you're just highlighting them. And so I'm like, all right, 1.5 minutes, go. And then they go through and they're starting and they're scanning. And then a lot of them start to do exactly what you would expect them to do, which is to start reading the text, because that's what they've been taught to do, right? You need to go in, you need to read the text, you need to understand the text. But I am teaching that skill of scanning because I know how important it is for them, especially as they move out of high school and into those next levels of work and college. And so I remind them during this time, hey, it looks like you're reading, stop reading, start scanning. And then I keep moving about the room. Hey, I see some of you reading, stop reading, start scanning. And then we keep going through. And so they may go through, and again, this is not a super high level text, so there might not be a whole lot of them. That's perfectly fine. But there might be a few of them that they don't know. And so we're just going to go through, we're going to scan, scan, scan. They might not know what the word skeptical means. They might not know what the term needle in a haystack means. I've found that that's definitely a case. They might not know what like disciplinary infractions are, etc. And so they're going to go through and they're going to highlight these words. Now, the next step to this is to take a couple of minutes, and I usually give them a few minutes, and I have them go and I have them look up these words. Except what I don't do is have them write down the definition of these words. What I have them do is read the definition of the word, and then I have them replace the word above or next to with a synonym, with a word that means a similar thing or a same thing, so that when they're reading, they can just keep reading and be like, oh, skeptical and this are similar words. I can just keep reading, but also now those two are connected in my brain probably forever. Okay? So if I was doing this one, I would say, okay, let's look at this one. In fact, admission officers tend to be skeptical of students who present themselves as individuals without flaws. So I might put the word questioning. Or maybe even suspicious, right? And so now when they're reading it, they can see this, again, all in connection with itself. So in fact, admission officers tend to be skeptical. They tend to be questioning of students who present themselves as individuals without flaws. Okay, skeptical means questioning. It means that you're like, I don't know. I don't know if that's true. And so they're just replacing these words right above them. And that way, the next time they actually do read this for the first time, in their brains, they're just making those connections. And again, if your students need more support to do their vocabulary and or to do some of those vocabulary pieces that are structured in to help them with that, obviously all of those can still be done. This is just at a baseline level where I start with my students so they can see how vocabulary really is important for understanding the conceptual nature of our texts. So now, we're down to number 6, which is our first read. So this really is going to be the first time that our students are going to be reading this. During this first read, not only are they reading it for understanding, but if you'll see in bold, they're going to be doing at least 3 observations. So that's going to be this piece right here. Now, observations are just, what are your thoughts? As you're reading this text, what are your initial thoughts, questions, connections, ideas? Because your brain doesn't turn off when you're reading. You don't just read and then sit there and look into space and there's nothing in your brain. When you read, you're making connections. You're thinking about things. And so what are those connections that you're making? And so I always do one of these together with them, and then they still do 3 of their own. So I usually go in, we look at the first paragraph together, and I say, okay, let's read paragraph 1 together. We're going to do this together. I'm going to put a little star here because I know that's where I'm going to do my observation. You guys will need to do 3 more, but this will be the example one. Okay, and then we read this together. I ask every student I interview for admissions to my institution, Pitzer College, the same question. What do you look forward to the most in college? I was stunned and delighted recently when a student sat across from me at a Starbucks in New York City and replied, I look forward to the possibility of failure. Of course, this is not how most students respond to that question when sitting before the person who can make decisions about their academic futures. But this young man took a risk. And so I'll tell them for me. So like as a teacher, I am glad that this young person was honest and open about their thoughts. And then I let them know, okay, so mine is based on my experience as a teacher. You guys aren't teachers, you're students. So yours is going to be based on your experiences. So maybe like that's terrifying for you. If you're reading that and you're like, oh my gosh, I would never say that. Like I would never tell an admissions officer that like I want to fail because then they're going to think that like I'm a failure. Great, that's your observation. Or maybe if you're like, I really hope that, people would want to hear that from me. Great, that's your observation. Observations are just about getting, again, your thoughts going, your brain working, and thinking about the first ways in which you're reacting to the text. Maybe there's a piece where you're like, I don't really understand what the author meant here. Great. Ask a question. Maybe you're like, oh, this is just like something else I've experienced or learned or another text. Great. Make that connection. But you're going to do 3 of those. And then what I do is give them time to go through, and I have them read this for the first time and do their first observations. And they always have to do at least 3. They can do more, but they must do at least 3. And that could take 10 minutes. It's going to, again, depend on your reading levels and your students and their needs. But I give them that time to go ahead and do the first read and do their observations. Now, once they are done with their observations, I typically have them turn to a partner, turn to a neighbor. Share one of your observations, whatever it is. Share one that's not too personal and or that you just think is important because it's a connection to the text. And that's just going to give them kind of some reference for not only what they were thinking, but also that, hey, maybe my ideas were similar to the person next to me. They were thinking the same thing, or they had a completely different idea. That's cool. They saw it a different way than me. And so I will take this as a moment to go ahead and have them communicate and talk with their neighbors so that it's not just them by themselves interacting with this text with no kind of like outside information, etc. So I will have them turn and talk about their observations, at least one of them. And then now we're on number 7. So number 7 is that now that you've read this, we need to chunk this. And this is where it gets to be a little bit more cumbersome because, again, this is the first time for a lot of our students that they've ever chunked anything or been asked to chunk anything or asked to like pick apart a text so that they can better understand what it is that the author is saying. So the way that I typically handle chunking is that we talk about what chunking really is. And we talk about the fact that when authors write, they do so with a purpose. And they do so in an ability, in the intent, to convey information to you, whatever that may be. And so they organize it in a certain way. And so then we talk about, hey, we know that every author, right, is going to start off by kind of introducing an idea. That's great. And that's going to start at paragraph 1. And we talk about bracketing. And this is where I tell them, hey, your paper is going to look like it's, has a lot of writing on it when you're done with it. That's okay. That's how it should look. And we talk about the fact that, okay, if we're going to bracket, we know that a chunk has to be at least paragraph 1. Can't chunk in the middle of a paragraph. We got to complete paragraphs together. So it could be just 1. It could be 1, 2, 3. It could be 1, 2, 5. Depends. So we're going to chunk these and put these together in a way that makes sense. In other words, I'm looking to see, okay, the author is talking about this. Are they still talking about that in the next paragraph? If so, it belongs with this chunk. Are they still talking about that same concept here? Great, it belongs here. If not, then hey, maybe our chunk ends there. And so this is typically where I will tell them tonight in pencil, I want you guys to try to chunk this. And I will have them take this piece home, go through, attempt to chunk it. I recommend that they do it in pencil so that way when we come in and we talk about it the next day, we can kind of revamp and go from there. And then they go through and do that. When they come back the next day, what I have them do is actually work because I have my groups in 4s. So my whole classroom is in groups of 4s. I have them work within their own groups to discuss and decide as a group where this should be chunked. And they have to be able to explain why it is that they chunked it the way that they did. And then we come together as a class and we have conversations. And I go through this one at a time. I'm like, all right, table 1, what was your first chunk? And they might tell me, 1 through 4. Okay, tell me why. And they would explain that. Table 6, what was your chunk? We only put 1 and 2 together. Okay, why? What was different from table 1? And then they're going to explain through it. Table 9, how did you guys chunk it? We chunked 1 through 3, and this is why. And then go there. This is when I then say, okay, let's talk about where I chunked the first piece. And this is where and why. And then I would explain to them the reasoning why I chunked it where I did. And so we would go through, and for this one, I would say, hey, this one is actually, we're going to chunk this here, 1, 2, and 3. And the reason is because this is really kind of background information. It's an introduction, and it's kind of a little analogy, right? So we're telling the story of this young man and why it introduces our topic. And then I have them turn their page sideways, and they're going to label what this section is. So this is going to be their intro. And then we're going to go through and we're going to chunk the rest. So again, I would go through that exact same process. It does take most of the period. So we're going to go through that same process. I have them discuss as a group. They come to, whatever their answer is. We discuss, and then I show them where I would chunk it. We talk about bracketing. doing brackets, and what I'm doing right now is just chunking it in the way that this is chunked. And so we do our little down arrows and up arrows when we switch pages, and then we finish our chunking. And then again, along the side of these, we're just going to basically write what each of these is, right? So this is our intro. 4 and 5 is really this idea of like perfection. And then we go from there. And so we talk about how labeling it along the side also gives us that background information when we come back to the text to say, oh, okay, that's right. If I want to go back and look at where the author talked about this thing, it's probably going to be in like this section here, right? The author talked about perfection, not wanting to see it. Okay, that's going to be in 4 and 5. And so we chunk this. And so at this point, we are where we need to be as far as kind of like understanding what this text says. And then the last piece before we get into the reading against the grain, which is where students are imparting their own ideas into this text, is to look at these chunks and say, okay, what are the main ideas or like the main purpose of each of these chunks? If chunk 1 is paragraphs 1 through 3 and the purpose is to introduce, then what sentence or what 4 to 5 words in here tell me what this chunk is about? And so then again, I have them work in their groups, go through, what would you guys underline? Again, it can be a whole sentence, it could be 4 or 5 words, and we do this chunk 1 together then after they've talked about it in their groups. And so I might say, okay, again, table 4, what did you guys do? Well, we highlighted some words. Okay, great. What words did you highlight? Oh, well, we underlined admissions. We underlined possibility of failure. We underlined succeed, right? We underlined all these words that we feel like get to the purpose of what he's going to be talking about. Perfect. Did anybody in the room do a sentence instead of words? A group is usually like, oh yeah, well, we underlined this sentence. Okay, so which one was it? And then they're like, oh, here, I wish I could tell you that this is uncommon, etc. And then they're able to tell me why it is that they underlined those pieces. And then I give them time to go in as groups. Again, they're working in partners or groups, and they're going in and they're underlining for the rest of the chunks what their main idea and or purposed sentence or statements are in those pieces. And again, that's going to help them get back to not only one, did I chunk this correctly? Because if it has more than one purpose or more than one main idea, it's probably not chunked correctly. 2, it's going to get them back to, okay, what are the things that this author really wants you to key in on? Well, these are the things this author really wants me to key in on. And so now we are at the end of them really getting the first read, the first understanding, getting to what this text is really about. And now we need to transition into how do they join the conversation? Because when I present any text to the students, I always present it as a conversation. The text is the author's half of the conversation. They're saying everything that they need to say in this text. You can only join the conversation by annotating, by adding your ideas, by responding to, questioning, whatever it is with the text. But in order to join the conversation, you've got to interact with this text. And so that's what this next piece is about. Now, because again, this is the first time that they've done they say, I says, typically I will do one with them. And I always give them a handout for they say, I says, which I can also provide that as well. If you would like, just let me know. But I always give them this handout for they say, I says. I apologize. It is very, very bright pink. But it has all the different they say, I say sentence frames broken down into their pieces and what they really are used for. And this is not my creation. All this is taking those pieces that are already in the They Say, I Say book and applying them in a way that's more like organized. That's it. So this was not my creation. Please do not give me credit for that. It is just stolen, and I provide that for my students. And so then what we do is we go through and I say, okay, so for each chunk, typically you're going to have to do a They Say, I Say. That gives you the ability to respond to the text in a functional way. And we'll go through and we'll do one together. And so I usually pick the very first paragraph or chunk, whatever that might be. And I'm going to go through and I'm going to help them write it. And I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to use this sentence frame, whatever that might be. I am going to talk about my experiences with what this author is talking about. And then we write this together. Now, I'm not going to rewrite this whole thing with you guys right this second. And I'm going to put this on the last page because it's the only blank page. But I would go through and I would walk them through writing a they say, I say using the sentence frame. And so I'm going to say, okay, this is my chunk one example, they say, I say, and I used the frame. Perez tells a story about students who are afraid to show imperfections, etc., etc. And I walk them through how this is really me joining the conversation with my experiences. Now, typically I would place this over here so that it could be with chunk one, but just here so that it's easy for you guys to read and see what I provide to them. And we would go through, create this together, and then again, I give them time to go through and do this together. Now, at this point, we've done this all together the first time. Doesn't mean it's the only time we're going to have to do it together. The first pieces are super easy. They get them down pretty quickly. They get that they have to highlight the title and do the prediction sentence, and they understand the ethos and the vocabulary. Where it starts to be where you kind of slowly have to release responsibility is when we get into that chunking piece, because that's a difficult piece for students because they're really having to look at the structure, the way that authors structure a text, the way that authors choose to write, the way that they choose to organize their ideas, etc. And that's a more difficult piece for them. And so there may need to be some more scaffolding in that. I usually do it multiple times before I release that completely to students to be like, all right, you guys have got this. Like, I think you can chunk this text completely by yourself, no conversations. And we just slowly release that piece. And then the same thing with the they say, I says. I typically don't assign every chunk at first. So for this first text, because it's one of the first ones we do in the year, I might say, hey, pick a chunk, do one really quality they say, I say. Then we look at it, I give feedback, they know what they need to be doing. And then from there, then it becomes, okay, you need to do one per chunk, or I slowly release, again, that responsibility to the students. And again, I hope this was helpful. I hope this gave kind of just a walkthrough of what it looks like with my students. This text, just so you are aware, would have been a 2-day process for me. So this is not something I would have done all in one period for sure, especially since I would have asked them to chunk this at home and come back so we could have some of those conversations. And it definitely would take longer with some of our longer texts. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out. I hope this was helpful. I hope it's functional. And I hope that you're able to utilize this in a way that works for you and that at least some of what's here is going to be helpful. Thank you so much, you guys.